A small chartered plane left Paris on May 13, 1948, carrying 4 people and climbing into weather that the pilot should not have trusted. One of those 4 people was Kathleen Kennedy, 28 years old, sister to a future president, daughter of one of the most powerful families in the history of American politics. She was not sightseeing. She was not on holiday. She was flying toward the south of France to meet her father, the one member of her family who had not yet fully closed the door on her, to ask for something her mother had already refused to give: his blessing. For a second marriage. To a second man her mother had sworn would cost Kick everything. The plane never landed. A storm came in fast over the mountains of southern France. What remained of the aircraft came to rest in a ravine near St. Basil, nose down, in a field that local farm workers reached on foot. Kathleen Kennedy was killed instantly, at 28, while flying toward the question her family had never let her finish asking. Here is what the newspapers didn't print. She had already buried one husband, a man she chose over her own family's approval, who was dead inside 5 months of the wedding. She was weeks away from a second marriage her mother had vowed would end in public disownment. And the man who might still have said yes was waiting in a Paris hotel, while his daughter's plane was coming apart in a storm over the Ardèche. This is the story of Kathleen Kennedy. The Kennedy daughter they couldn't contain, couldn't redirect, and couldn't quite bring themselves to bury with the rest of the family when she was gone. Her name was Kathleen. Everyone who loved her called her Kick. She was born on February 20, 1920, in Brookline, Massachusetts, fourth of 9 children, second daughter, inside a household that ran less like a family home and more like a headquarters being operated under constant audit. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was not simply wealthy. He was strategically wealthy, a man who understood that money without position was just arithmetic, and that position without power was theater. By the time most of his children could read, he had already built fortunes in banking, film distribution, and stock speculation, and he had already begun converting those fortunes into something the Kennedy name had never quite owned outright: respectability, with American political power engineered permanently onto it. Rose Kennedy ran the household accordingly. Mass every morning. Confession on a calendar. She kept a physical card catalog on each child, actual index cards, updated by hand, tracking grades, sermon notes, physical measurements, and social appointments, filed like inventory on a shipping manifest. This is not a detail biographers invented for texture. It is documented. The cards exist. And what they represent is a mother who could not separate affection from management, who understood her children, in some fundamental way, as a project requiring optimization. Rose was not indifferent to them. That distinction matters. She was present. She was thorough. She wrote letters, attended performances, followed academic records with unusual care. But love, in this house, arrived in a particular register, organized, systematic, and aimed at producing a result. There was warmth in the Kennedy household. There was also a scoreboard. Kick did not score well on the scoreboard, and everyone around her knew it early. At Hyannisport, where the family summered in their compound on the water, the children were sorted constantly into teams, sailing races, touch football on the lawn, competitions Joseph Sr. treated as rehearsals for public life rather than leisure. He wanted children who could win in front of a camera and lose gracefully in front of one too. Kick played as hard as any of her brothers and argued louder when a call went against her. Her father seemed to enjoy it. Her mother filed it. She attended the Riverdale Country School in New York, then a convent of the Sacred Heart in Noroton, Connecticut, chosen partly because the boys who kept calling on her at Riverdale couldn't follow her there. It slowed nothing down. A year at a Sacred Heart convent in Neuilly, France, gave her fluent French and a pull toward Europe that never fully left. She was loud where her sisters were trained to be composed. She made friends the way other people make enemies, instantly, without asking anyone's permission first. Joe Jr. treated her like a co-conspirator. Jack, 2 years older, treated her like the only Kennedy who understood what he meant before he finished saying it. Rose's plan for her daughters was simple and never hidden. Marry Catholic. Marry well. Disappear into a husband's name and reappear at Christmas, smiling in the photograph. The sons would have careers, campaigns, history. The daughters would have marriages, strategic, contained, and conducted without complication. The logic underneath that plan was one the family never stated directly. The Kennedys were Catholic, Irish-American, and newly arrived at the level of wealth that required respectability to be maintained rather than simply purchased. Any crack in the image, a daughter who made headlines for the wrong reasons, a marriage that gave opponents ammunition, a public choice that contradicted the family's carefully assembled story, threatened not just the individual but the entire structure Joseph S.R. had spent 2 decades building. His children were, in the most precise sense of that word, assets. Kik was the asset that kept refusing to behave like one. In 1938, with Joseph Kennedy named United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James's, the family relocated to London. Kik was 18. She was presented at court as a debutante on May 12 of that year, white dress, formal ceremony, Kennedy press apparatus fully operational. Within weeks, the British press had named her debutante of the year. 9 years of convent schooling had taught her how to behave inside a formal room. London taught her something Massachusetts never had, that being genuinely herself in public didn't have to cost her anything. That same spring, the family traveled to Rome for the coronation of Pope Pius Roman XII. Kik wrote home that the crowd's reaction to the new pope carried more real feeling than any political rally she'd witnessed elsewhere in Europe that year. It was a small observation, made quickly, in a private letter. But it tells you something about her, a young woman raised inside a household where faith and performance were constantly adjacent, who had already learned to notice the seam where they came apart. At a garden party that summer, she met William Cavendish. He was known universally as Billy. He was the Marquess of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire, heir to one of the largest private fortunes in England, heir to Chatsworth, heir to centuries of Anglican tradition, and heir to a family that had, within living memory, actively campaigned at the ballot box against Catholic political rights. He was reserved where she was electric. He was everything that Rose Kennedy's framework said was wrong. They talked for hours. Neither one wanted to stop first. Rose noticed immediately and registered her disapproval without ambiguity. What she was actually afraid of, stripped of the theological language she preferred, was straightforward. Under Catholic doctrine as the Church taught it then, marrying outside the faith without a formal dispensation put a soul at risk on the Church's own accounting. Any children would almost certainly be raised Anglican. The next generation, Kennedy grandchildren, would grow up inside the Cavendish family's religion rather than her own. This was not, to Rose, a romantic complication. It was a ledger problem. And it was also a message problem. A Kennedy daughter publicly attached to a Protestant English aristocrat, in the years when Joseph S.R.'s own political standing was already under pressure in the press, was exactly the kind of distraction the family could not afford. Their courtship ran on stolen weekends anyway. Kik wrote to Jack about a day and a half spent with Billy in the English countryside that made her forget the war existed for 24 consecutive hours. Then, in September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany and the Kennedys sailed home. An ocean closed between Kik and the only person outside her own family who had ever made her feel completely unguarded. It would stay closed for nearly 4 years. She did not spend those years in quiet waiting. She enrolled briefly at a business college in Florida, then talked her way into a research position at the Washington Times-Herald under executive editor Frank Waldrop. She assisted a columnist named Inga Arved on a feature series profiling Washington officials. When Arved eventually left the paper, Kik inherited the column, a byline reviewing theater and film, appearing under her own name, answering to no father and attached to no husband. This was not a small thing. For a Kennedy daughter in 1941, a paycheck earned on deadline, under her own name, in a city that had nothing to do with Hyannisport, that was independence of a kind the family had never mapped out for a girl. Joseph S.R. ran his children's career trajectories the way he ran everything else, deliberately, with outcomes already selected. A daughter with an unsupervised byline in a Washington newspaper was not part of the plan. Washington itself was running on wartime urgency by then, restless, self-conscious, aware of its own consequence in ways the city hadn't been before the war changed everything. Kik cultivated sources the way natural politicians do, by being genuinely interested in people and genuinely enjoyable to be around. She was not performing. That was the difference. The Kennedy household had produced several children who were excellent at performing genuine interest. Kik simply had it. The column. The byline. The apartment that belonged to her. For the first time in her adult life, she had built something the family hadn't approved in advance. It would not be the last time. In June 1943, she sailed back across the Atlantic, joining the American Red Cross and taking assignment to run a servicemen's club at Hans Crescent in London. Billy was waiting. And so, sharpened by 4 additional years of certainty, was Rose's opposition. The engagement between Kik Kennedy and Billy Cavendish created a problem with no clean solution. For Kik to marry Billy in a Catholic ceremony, the church required him to sign a formal agreement that any children would be raised Catholic. Billy refused, not out of hostility, but because he was the Cavendish heir, and the Cavendish heir raising Catholic children was not something either his family or his political constituency could absorb quietly. For Kik to marry outside the church without dispensation was, in the doctrinal framework she had been raised inside, a serious transgression. The church's position was not ambiguous. Her mother's position was even less so. Priests on both sides of the Atlantic weighed in. Bishops were consulted. Joe Jr. flew to London and argued the case from every angle he could construct. None of it moved the underlying positions. The church wouldn't bend. Billy wouldn't sign. And Kik would not stop. Then, 3 months before the wedding, something happened that made the situation politically worse for everyone. Billy stood as the official Conservative candidate in the West Derbyshire by-election in February 1944, a seat his family had held so reliably for so long that local observers treated the result as a formality. His opponent was Charles White, 62 years old, running as an independent socialist, whose own father had beaten a Cavendish for that same seat decades before. Winston Churchill personally backed Billy. The newspapers treated the result as a foregone conclusion. White beat him by more than 4,000 votes. Time magazine covered the defeat from London. Churchill reportedly sat in his study calling it a blow to the wartime government. Billy had just lost the one seat his family had never lost in living memory. Weeks before marrying a woman his prospective mother-in-law was still actively working to talk him out of marrying. On May 6, 1944, Kathleen Kennedy married him anyway. Civil ceremony. Chelsea Town Hall. The Duke of Devonshire signed the register. The Duke of Rutland stood as best man. The guest list on the bride's side says everything the family wouldn't say in words. Of 9 Kennedy children and 2 parents, exactly 1 relative crossed the Atlantic. Her brother Joe Jr. in his U.S. Navy uniform gave her away. He stands just behind her left shoulder in the wedding photographs, the single Kennedy in the room, in a ceremony that should have filled 3 pews. Rose did not attend. Joseph S.R. did not attend. According to multiple biographers, Rose spent the day not with her daughter but at a private mass of mourning, treating the wedding the way the church treats a death. Kik wore pink instead of white and carried a posy of camellias cut that same morning from the grounds of Chatsworth, carried 200 miles south to London. The family she was marrying in sent flowers to the altar before the ceremony began. Her own family sent a single brother and a great deal of managed silence. By August, with Billy deployed to Belgium and the by-election loss still fresh in local memory, Kik made her first public appearance as Lady Hardington at the Bakewell Fair, campaigning across her husband's old constituency. The same voters who had rejected him turned out to adore her. The Duke's political agent wrote afterward that she would be an asset to the family's political future once the war ended. That future was already closing, though none of them knew it yet. 5 weeks after the wedding, Billy was shipped to the front with the Coldstream Guards. 4 weeks after that, on August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. volunteered for a secret high-risk bombing run over the English Channel rather than rotate home after completing his required tour. The mission involved a remote-controlled aircraft packed with explosives, triggered to detonate over a submarine installation on the French coast. The plane exploded prematurely, somewhere over the channel, before the crew could bail out. Joe Jr. was 29. Kik was in London when the telegram arrived, waiting for Billy's next letter from Belgium. That letter came in early September. Billy described the liberation of Brussels, crowds lined up along both sides of the road, people throwing flowers onto Allied tanks, a city losing its mind with relief. He wrote that there was a lump in his throat that hadn't fully gone away, and that the only thing missing was her beside him, seeing it too. It was the last letter he ever sent. On September 9, 1944, leading his company in an attempt to capture the Belgian town of Heppen from German Waffen-SS troops, Billy Cavendish was shot through the heart by a sniper. He was 26. He is buried at the Leopoldsburg War Cemetery in Belgium, among the men of his own regiment, not in the family vault at Chatsworth he was born to inherit. A husband and a brother dead inside 9 weeks. There is no elegant way to place that arithmetic. Joe Jr. had been the eldest, the son around whom the entire Kennedy political project had been constructed, the one Joseph S.R. had been preparing for the White House for 2 decades. Billy had been the person Kik defied every expectation to reach, the marriage that cost her family attendance, blessing, and 5 years of her mother's carefully maintained approval, dead before anyone could know whether that cost had been worth what it purchased. She had paid in full. The prize lasted less than 5 months. The Duchess of Devonshire wrote to her daughter-in-law after Billy's death, promising to love her for the rest of her own life, simply for the happiness Kik had given her son in the months he had left. It was a kindness Kik's own mother had not offered her at the wedding. It had not arrived after the engagement. It had not come during 4 years of opposition and managed delay. It arrived now from the exact family Rose Kennedy had spent years positioning as the wrong choice, the wrong faith, the wrong future. It arrived from the people who had shown up. Grief, in the Kennedy household, carried a rule. Kennedys didn't cry, not in public, not for cameras, not even reliably for each other. Joseph S.R. had spent 2 decades teaching his children that a wounded face in a photograph was a liability the family's image couldn't carry. Even loss required correct presentation. The family sent condolences after Billy's death. They were properly worded. They arrived on time. They read like correspondence. Kik folded that letter and stayed in England. That single decision, staying, mattered more than it appears on paper. A widowed, childless American in her mid-20s could have gone home to Hyannisport and let the family absorb her back into its rhythms. The lawn games, the sailing races, the dinner table debates calibrated to sharpen the surviving brothers for careers that were already being planned. Instead, she kept her flat in London. She grieved, by all available accounts, without making a performance of it. And then she began building something that had never been on the Kennedy family calendar. She took a townhouse near the Houses of Parliament. She filled it most evenings with young Conservative MPs, junior ministers, and the kind of post-war political talent that would go on to run Britain for the next 30 years. London in those years was still rationed and bomb-scarred, a city still replacing its windows, still calculating what it had lost. The contrast between what London looked like in 1945 and what Kik's townhouse felt like on any given evening was not lost on anyone who moved through both. A widow in her mid-20s, at the center of the one room in a damaged city where the conversation ran past midnight and nobody asked her to be quieter or smaller or more appropriate. Evelyn Waugh became a regular. He warned her, directly, in plainly Catholic terms, what the Church said awaited a Catholic who married outside the faith a second time. He was, by his own later admission, more than slightly in love with her himself. What drew him, one biographer noted, was less the woman than the room, a salon assembled from threads of a political world she could admire from the inside but could never formally join back home. Waugh published Brideshead Revisited in 1945, a novel haunted by a wealthy Catholic family torn apart by faith, marriage, and a mother who treats her daughter's choices as spiritual emergencies. He drew on several real households while writing it. Kick's situation, and Rose's behavior in the months surrounding the wedding, sat close enough to his own circle that elements surfaced directly in the novel. The Devonshires held onto her completely. Billy's family treated her not as a brief in-law from a marriage cut short, but as their own, inviting her to estate events, keeping her inside the household's orbit, treating her presence as something they intended to maintain. His brother Andrew had married Deborah Mitford, youngest of the Mitford sisters, which meant Kick now shared a dinner table with one of the most written about families in England, through a marriage her own mother had fought for years to prevent. Without entirely planning it, she had built a life in which Rose Kennedy's signature was no longer required on anything. She was 25 years old. Then, in 1946, at a London ball, the second decision arrived. His name was Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, heir to Wentworth Woodhouse, a Yorkshire estate so vast its front facade takes 10 minutes to walk end to end. Decorated cavalry officer. Owner of racehorses. Reputation as a gambler. He moved through post-war London with the careless confidence of a man who had never once had to ask the price of anything he wanted. He was charming in the specific way of people for whom charm has never failed, which is to say he was charming in a way that should have been a warning, and wasn't. He was Church of England. He was also still married, in the slow contested process of securing a divorce from his wife. History, for Kick, had a habit of repeating its terms while quietly raising the stakes. Wentworth Woodhouse sat in South Yorkshire coal country, an estate so large that its staff, in its working years, outnumbered the populations of the villages surrounding it. Marrying Fitzwilliam would have meant trading one enormous house for an even larger one set of obligations and tenants and expectations for a second, heavier set. Kick had already learned, at 24, that a great house did not protect the person living inside it from anything that actually mattered. She seemed to want Fitzwilliam entirely apart from the address attached to him. That was, in its way, the clearest evidence yet that she had stopped marrying institutions and started simply choosing people. The relationship drew immediate attention. British gossip columns tracked the couple through race meetings and country house weekends. Fitzwilliam's pending divorce gave reporters on both sides of the Atlantic a hook they didn't need to sharpen. A widowed Kennedy daughter, a marchioness no less, conducting a very visible relationship with a married earl. One biographer who later interviewed people who had known the couple was direct about it. Fitzwilliam had money and charm in roughly equal supply, and fidelity in noticeably shorter supply than either. Kick did not seem to require him to be faithful. She had already buried a husband who was what she wanted, after years of being carefully managed by people who claimed to love her, was to choose for herself again, with full knowledge of the consequences. Rose's response skipped past disappointment and went straight to ultimatum. She told Kick, in language several biographers describe as unambiguous, that marrying a divorced man would mean disownment, public, permanent, and financial. For a family that measured loyalty partly in trust documents and partly in seating arrangements at the family table, this was not an idle threat. It was a ledger entry already drafted. But the threat carried something underneath it that was never quite spoken directly. Rose Kennedy had spent decades building a family image that required complete alignment. Every Kennedy was supposed to serve the project. Every marriage was supposed to reinforce it. Kick had tested the structure once already, with Billy, with the civil ceremony, with the pink dress and the single brother in the photographs. The structure had bent. It had not broken. A second marriage, this time to a divorced Protestant earl whose relationship with the bride had been tracked through gossip columns on 2 continents. That was not a bend. That was a fracture the family's public mythology could not absorb. Rose told Kik what the price was. Kik did not back down. She had already buried one husband for choosing differently than her mother wanted. She was not about to let a ledger entry determine what her life looked like next. Old money tragedy tells the stories hidden beneath wealth, status, family, and reputation. Subscribe for more. By spring of 1948, Fitzwilliam's divorce was close enough to final that a wedding was being planned. But Kik wanted one thing first. Not her mother's blessing. That door had been shut, and she appears to have made a kind of peace with the fact that it was not reopening at any price. What she wanted was her father's. Joseph S.R. was the more pragmatic of the 2 Kennedy parents, a man who had spent his career separating personal disapproval from political calculation, and the kind of man who might decide, given the right timing and the right approach, that opposing a daughter a second time would cost the family more than simply letting her go. He had not attended her first wedding. He had not publicly endorsed her choices. But he had also not disowned her. There was, in that silence, a door still slightly open. She learned he would be in Paris in May 1948. She booked passage immediately. Fitzwilliam traveled alongside her. Step back for a moment and consider what this journey actually meant. Kik Kennedy had spent a decade proving she did not need her family's permission. She had built a career without it, a marriage without it, a London salon without it, a life without it. She had defied her mother's ultimatums and buried the husband her mother called a mistake and kept the title and the address and the circle of friends that came with a family Rose had never wanted her to join. She had done all of that. And at 28, she was still crossing an ocean to ask for someone's blessing before she walked into the next chapter. Whatever had changed about Kik Kennedy since she stood at a garden party at 18 and talked to a reserved English marquess until neither of them noticed the hour, that instinct hadn't changed. She still needed to be chosen back. By someone who shared her blood. By someone who knew her before London and Billy and the pink dress and the telegram and the 9 weeks that changed everything. She needed her father to say yes. What was actually said between Kik and Joseph S.R. in Paris is not fully recorded. Accounts differ on the sequence of events. Some suggest the meeting with her father had already taken place by the time the couple boarded their next flight. Others indicate it was still scheduled to occur after a short stop on the Riviera. What every available account confirms without dispute is this: on May 13, 1948, Kathleen Kennedy and Peter Fitzwilliam boarded a chartered de Havilland Dove aircraft in Paris, bound for the south of France. The plane left the ground at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. It climbed to 10,000 feet over countryside that was still, 3 years after the war ended, in the slow work of pulling itself back together. About an hour into the flight, over the Ardèche department, the aircraft encountered a storm front moving in fast off the massive central. Dense cloud. Severe turbulence. Villages on the ground below would report later that they hadn't heard the engines until moments before impact. Radio contact was lost. When the pilot finally broke through the cloud layer, the aircraft was already in a steep dive, far too close to the terrain to recover from. The structural strain tore one wing loose. Then both engines. Then the tail section. What remained of the fuselage struck the side of a plateau near the village of St. Basil and came to rest nose down in a ravine. Local farm workers reached the wreckage on foot. There was nothing for them to do but confirm what the impact had already made irreversible. Kathleen Kennedy Cavendish, Marchioness of Hartington, was killed instantly. So was Peter Fitzwilliam. So was the pilot, Peter Townsend. So was the navigator, Arthur Freeman. History records the first 2 names. It rarely bothers with the last 2 men doing their jobs, attached forever to a story about love and money and family approval that was never theirs. French investigators attributed the crash to the storm, a sudden, violent loss of visibility that drove the aircraft into a dive with neither the altitude nor the structural margin to recover. No mechanical failure isolated. No single human error identified. Weather arriving at the one moment it could do the most permanent damage. She was 28 years old. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic ran the crash as front-page news within a day. American readers received a Kennedy daughter, dead in a glamorous accident abroad. British readers received a Marchioness and an Earl, names recognizable enough from gossip columns that the romantic complications needed almost no explaining. Almost none of the early coverage mentioned the religious standoff, the financial ultimatum, or the decade of managed distance that had quietly defined the final years of her life. That part stayed inside the family, exactly where the Kennedys had always preferred it. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. flew to England alone. He was, by every available account, the only member of the Kennedy family to attend his daughter's funeral. He stood at her graveside. The rest of his children remained in the United States. Rose Kennedy did not come. Contemporary accounts indicate she checked into a hospital around the same time, citing a nervous collapse. The mother who had spent a decade directing her daughter's choices was, by her own arrangement, absent from the single ceremony that closed the argument permanently. Whether that absence was grief, guilt, or the simple impossibility of standing over a grave that was, in some sense, a consequence of the same ultimatums she had spent years issuing, the record does not say. What the record shows is only the absence itself. A hospital bed. An ocean between them, again, at the last moment it mattered. Jack felt the loss more than most of his siblings let on at the time. By 1948 he was a freshman congressman from Massachusetts, already living with the chronic back pain that would follow him for the rest of his life, and he did not cross the Atlantic. Of all 9 Kennedy children, biographers consistently describe Kik as the one he had been closest to since childhood, the one who understood him, the one who argued back, the one who treated his intelligence as something to match rather than defer to. His absence from her graveside was imposed by distance and circumstance rather than choice. That distinction matters. And it changed nothing about where he was standing when they buried her. She was not buried in Massachusetts. Not in the Kennedy family plot. Not in the ground where Kennedys across generations would eventually come to rest. She was buried at St. Peter's Churchyard in Edinburgh, in Derbyshire, on the grounds of the Chatsworth estate, among the Cavendish family she had married into and, in every sense except the legal one, never left. The Devonshires arranged the funeral. They chose the stone. Tenants from the estate lined the lane into the churchyard, the same fields she had campaigned across 4 years earlier for a husband who was already in his grave in Belgium. They came out in numbers. They stood in the Derbyshire drizzle and they lined the path and they claimed her, in death, with a warmth her own family had managed to summon for most of her adult life only in letters. One detail outlived every threat that had come before it. Rose had promised, in plain terms, that marrying a divorced man would cost Kik her inheritance entirely. That wedding never happened. The dissownment was never formally executed. Kik died still technically a daughter in good standing, having spent her final months bracing for a financial reckoning that the weather made irrelevant before it could be delivered. 3 graves. Billy in a Belgian war cemetery, among his regiment. Fitzwilliam buried separately, by his own family, in his own corner of England. Kik in Derbyshire, in ground that belonged to the family her mother had called the wrong choice. Not one of those graves is inside the plot she was born into. She was not the only Kennedy daughter the family had learned to manage rather than reckon with. Years before Kik's death, her older sister Rosemary had been quietly removed from public view following the surgical procedure performed in 1941 on Joseph Sr. Direct orders, a lobotomy that left her severely impaired, placed her permanently in institutional care, and kept her almost entirely outside the family's public narrative for decades. When Rosemary surfaced in Kennedy family accounts at all, it was briefly, carefully, and in terms that emphasized her condition rather than the decision that caused it. Kick's removal was different in kind, but not entirely different in impulse. It was social rather than medical, voluntary rather than imposed. She was not sent anywhere. She was simply excluded from the wedding guest list, from the family mythology, from the version of the Kennedys that America came to know through the 1950s and 1960s. A daughter whose choices complicated the preferred image was something to be managed at a distance. The family had developed a particular talent for that. For nearly 2 decades after 1948, Kick's story barely surfaced in the public version of the Kennedy family. Her surviving brothers built a political dynasty large enough to eclipse almost everything that preceded it. A presidency, an attorney general's office, a Senate seat held across nearly half a century. By the early 1960s, magazines and newsreels had turned the family into something approaching American royalty, matching smiles, touch football photographs, a brand constructed on exactly the same instinct for image management Joseph S.R. had spent his career perfecting. The mythology required a specific kind of Kennedy. Winners, Catholics in good standing, people whose choices advanced the story rather than complicating it. Kick complicated it. Here is the particular irony that the family never publicly acknowledged. In 1960, John F. Kennedy ran for president and spent a significant portion of his campaign convincing the American electorate that a Catholic in the White House would not take instructions from Rome, that his religion was a private matter, not a governing ideology, and that the country's democratic institutions were safe in Catholic hands. The same family that had threatened to publicly disown a daughter for marrying a Protestant staked the American presidency 15 years later on persuading the country that Catholicism posed no threat to civic life. Nobody in the family pointed this out. Kick had been dead for over a decade. She was not available to point it out herself. Inside the polished mythology, the daughter who married a duke's heir, buried him inside 5 months, fell in love with a married earl, and died flying toward her father's approval on a storm-covered French mountainside did not fit the frame. For years she was a footnote in books about her brothers, a photograph in an archive, a name grouped, without much additional comment, under the general heading of Kennedy family misfortune, as though what happened to her was weather, not choice. Some historians argue against the curse framing entirely, noting that a family with 9 children, a taste for fast boats and small aircraft, and the kind of risk tolerance that accompanies generational wealth was always going to accumulate tragedy across a century. That argument is probably correct. And it does Kick no particular favors, because the curse framing was never really about explaining what happened to her. It was about absorbing her into a pattern that required no individual examination. Calling it a curse meant nobody had to ask whether it was something else, whether the decisions made around her, as much as the ones she made herself, had anything to do with it. It took outside researchers, not the Kennedy family itself, to put Kathleen back into the historical record. Lynn McTaggart published the first full biographical account of Kick's life in 1983, built largely from private letters and family documents that had not been made public before. The book required access the family was not initially eager to provide. It required interviews with people who had known her in England, in the drawing rooms, at the Devonshire estate, at the London townhouse that the family's own mythology had never bothered to describe. Decades later, Paula Byan followed with a biography whose argument was stated directly in the title. Kick was the most fully realized of the Kennedy children. A documentary eventually folded her story into a wider series on American women who married into the British aristocracy, giving her a chapter of her own, at last. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library mounted its first dedicated exhibition on Kick's life within recent years, framing her in the language of joy, joy given, joy found, and leaving the cost, perhaps deliberately, outside the title. The cost is not a side note. It is the center of the story. She had too little time with either man she chose for any final accounting of happiness to work out cleanly. What she bought with both marriages, with the byline, with the London townhouse, with the ocean crossing in May 1948, What she purchased with all of it was authorship. A say in her own story while it was still being written. Most of the Kennedy daughters were handed a script, marry inside the lines, disappear into a husband's name, reappear on schedule, and ask nothing for yourself that the family hadn't already pre-approved. Kick tore that script up twice, in the two most consequential decisions of her adult life. The first time, it cost her less than 5 months of marriage before a sniper's bullet settled the question permanently, and the family that showed up for the aftermath was the one her mother had spent years calling the wrong choice. The second time, it cost her everything, on a mountainside in France, in a storm that arrived without warning, before the question she had crossed an ocean to ask was ever fully answered by the one parent still willing to hear it. Joseph Kennedy stood at her grave alone in a Derbyshire churchyard while his wife checked into a hospital 3,000 miles away. The daughter they had spent a decade trying to redirect was buried in ground that belonged to the people who had claimed her without conditions, a family that had never required her to be quieter or more convenient or more aligned with a plan that had been drawn up before she had any say in it. She was 28 years old. She had already lived more freely than most people manage in twice the time, and the family that built a dynasty around the brother she had loved most never quite made room, in that gleaming public story, for the sister who had already shown them, earlier than any of them, what it actually looked like to choose.